Okay, pleased to see you again. We convene to discuss the rest of the topic about principles and politics in administrative law. Well, actually, it is important to practice what we learn. Yes? We have a couple of the cases, and to understand more finely about what the right way of public administration, how do you see? However, we see the failings historically of decades. You consider what is that? The catastrophe in South Korea, Seoul, also follows up with this that question. So a scope of failings could be identified when you what you may experience is news headlines of weeks or what is that, and one good illustration in comparison with FEMA, what is the organizations. You also regret about the kind of competence from foreign agencies or units. So one British seaman stated, we actually highly agile to respond, to act on the scene effectively. At the early times, an accident would be critical to determine the extent of a victimization. I have charted one picture. What is that? A space shuttle. You may know one important, one tragic accident involving airspace shuttle. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, what they call NASA, is a responsible institution about space matters and its administration. And actually, the space will be hyped in national strategy, and actually must be practical. You see many big powers, China and Russia, they glad enter into competition about the space hegemony. But the Challenger space shuttle ambitiously took off. Even they know, even if they know that cold temperatures at launch threaten the integrity of the O-ring seals, it would be an important component to propel the space shuttle, and maybe it got out of order in that situation. But it nonetheless was executed for their mission. One failure about the requirement the agencies should pay due diligence and regard about safety and others. So if I had to pick up the single most important thing in this subject, students should understand in order to appreciate the importance of administrative law. It will be the message of the Old Testament book of Genesis. Administrable law exists because humans are imperfect. So we see anomalies around us. A policeman may brutalize innocent civilians. We consider the sad story from Alabama in the first of this class. And we also some inflated images of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents who shot their members of Branch Davidian sect as they tried to escape the flames at the compound in Waco, Texas. It's a fascinating documentary, Waco, The Rules of Engagement. The evidence indicates that the fire was started probably inadvertently by the FBI, not by the Branch Davidians. Both NASA and the FBI tried to cover up these failings. Challenger Space Shuttle and Waco accident. All of us can recount stories about selfishness and ignorance. The point is, our political system aspires to minimize these wrongs. There's a similarity in recent cases, selfishness and ignorance. Of course, we will consider the issues of liability of government or any others, and also the topic to be dealt in that aspect. And I also suppose the stories will follow in courtroom and others. As you said at the beginning, from a normative standpoint, administrable seeks the maximum feasible reduction of human arbitrariness. What is your imagination in this context? For example, a nuclear power plant is a notorious issue. The agencies now are incompetent to handle the waste, and actually could potentially dangerous to degrade the environment and even to the human harms. And still, we cautiously generate the nuclear power in these facilities. And what others? Officials who knew about sexual harassment by teachers and students allowed it to continue. In spite of the potentially disastrous consequence of global warming, the Environment Protection Agency chose not to regulate carbon emissions from motor vehicles. You also are reminded of Massachusetts versus EPA, and also the ethical code on sexual harassment in the workplace. Introduced the ethics code, codified, enacted by University of Massachusetts. And in some cases, the wrongs may be debated about intentional conduct. How do you perceive, for example, injection of lethal chemicals to execute the criminals? So the inmate in association appeal to the practice of death penalty. What is that? Electronic chair would be decent, for example. And the issue would involve the Food and Drug Administration. And actually, the litigation could be explored in another perspective or frame of a legal series. For example, you may consider the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. How do you expect the outcome would change if the attorney raised another point? So the court proceeding would become vulnerable in some cases about its limited structure and authority. It's the frame of cause of action, how to shape cause of action would determine the outcome of case. The Food and Drug Administration may respond with that question. Is it permissible to inject lethal toxic chemicals to support a national criminal policy? Is it decent? And does it fall within the meaning of a statute about Food and Drug Administration? And one other case, for example, involving FDA, would be notable, which is a cigarette case. How do you consider a tobacco industry influential to affect the court decisions? The Fourth Circuit actually in jurisdiction about West Virginia and would be conservative, and tobacco industry would be located heavily and clustered within this region. So actually, the petition pursued the designation of FDA about tobacco within the meaning of statute. The Fourth Circuit of Federal District would deny its status within the meaning of statute. It could not fall within the classes of a Food and Drug Administration. What is a food and drug? So we have a scope of interesting stories, which emanates from court precedents. I also reiterate, since it is important, Administrative Law 6, the maximum feasible reduction of arbitrariness. That being its goal, Administrative Law aims to resolve controversies in a manner that is fair, accurate, efficient, and satisfactory to the litigants in the administrative process. The Administrative Law game debates how to meet this standard. Specifically, we argue that some cases and some doctrines covered earlier in this class discussion more efficiently meet our task than the others. So actually, the administrative law and public administration would become a subject in the analogy with a baseball game. We encounter politics, and for politics there is no need summary. So it is continued. It's actually contended in the court of routinely, and the law will evolve on continual basis, not cease to be stored in any absolute terms. Changing circumstances and adaptation is an indispensable attribute found in law. Well, baseball, in the baseball game, you see the spectators disappointed in some cases for their squads, or exalted in some other cases, who witnessed any victory for their team. That could not be stopped in that day, on that day alone. So it did continue, and we see another day to compete. That could be same in the preserve of law. They do not use bad balls or what. It has moments. They, however, do not use helmets. What is that? They use a language and a logic to interact with politics and public policy. The people play law not with balls and bats and gloves, but with words and arguments. One of the rules of the law game is that the adversaries can argue about what the law ought to mean in each case. Often players of the law game are expected to disagree about what the rules mean and how they affect the outcome of a particular case. In arguing about what the law ought to mean, legal actors appear to and exploit the extra-legal world of political events, relationships, and values. So we can see a holistic picture of public domain. The justices may be more clerical in some cases, and should be, and of course tend to be fairly normative, but often required to get possessive of a political exposure to the political events and relationships and values, what the society actually desires, right, to realize the public value or interest. When abstract legal ideas are applied in concrete situations, the fact that our society has limited resources can make those ideas difficult to implement. So it is one of a structural constraint, as we learn in constitutional theory and tenet, and also financial limitations for the ambitious code. They may appreciate the desired status of a public administration, but could not get extended to reach that dimension. So administrative government is essentially dependent on the resources of nation, typically financial resources, in some cases human personnel, professionals to respond with that needs. Goldberg-type hearings cost a lot more time and money than the informal hearing in the principal's office before the student gets suspended from school. So you may benefit if we survey some terrains with illustration of interesting cases. Judge David Batchelor's demand for good hard look at rulemaking in the area of nuclear waste appear to be just the kind of motivation needed in the industry to finally address the health threats posed by nuclear waste. Instead, the Supreme Court's decision in Vermont Yankee allowed a regulatory process influenced by economic interest to let the problem worsen over time. Today is 30 years after the Supreme Court decided the case. The problem of nuclear waste is far from being solved. Even though the government proposed a permanent site for disposal on the Yucca Mountain, Nevada, scientists and public interest organizations continue to point out the grave shortcomings of this solution. So judging it to be specifically and with enthusiasm to penetrate the case only, often we see judges do not meet our standard when, as in the Horowitz case, they hide behind generalizations and abstractions. As we all know, schools and families are sometimes cooperative and sometimes rife with conflict. Judges do, on the other hand, meet our test when they do not mechanically demand that all 10 Goldberg ingredients be used in every hearing. Each of these cases depends on good judgment, not the legalistic or formulaic thinking of the kind illustrated in the state sovereignty cases decided at the end of Supreme Court's 1999 term. So the federalism and dual sovereignty would also want a structural thought to understand the public administration in the United States. And I introduced, for example, the article from Bradford R. Clark, what the Supremacist Clause as a constraint on federal power. So the author would see the shortcomings of Supremacist Clause, which actually would be possible, perhaps, by fine frame the clause by constitutional drafters. So we see a summary form that here's he explores highly possessively through the text, history, and current practices. I might have a wrong preparation, so we must be carried erroneous here. Sorry. It is not entirely unworthy of observation that in declaring what shall be the supreme law of the land, the Constitution itself is first mentioned, and not the laws of the United States generally, but those only which shall be made in pursuance of the Constitution have that rank. So can you proper coherence in dealings? Could you derive a legitimatory in order about the federal norms? That is one important topic which remains our elaboration in next class. And also, federalism actually affects how the state and local levels of administration would be shaped normatively in accordance with this idea. Federalism is the horizontal division of governmental power between the federal government and state governments. There is, however, supremacy in the U.S. Constitution. Consider, for example, case 1. North Carolina counties may not regulate swine farms. North Carolina has a Swine Farm Seeding Act and an Animal Waste Management Systems Act, and has regulations promulgated there. Those acts are administered by State Environmental Management Commission. Nonetheless, the Casson County Board of Commissioners and its Board of Health decided that the county wanted additional local control over swine farming and enacted an ordinance to regulate swine farming and a joining ordinance to regulate the location of swine farms. The goal was to regulate the operation, construction, and expansion of swine farms. A swine farmer had to obtain a permit and comply with all federal North Carolina and local laws and regulations. Local regulations establish setback distances and buffer zones more stringent than state requirements. The county also set financial assurance requirements and prescribed a semi-annual well test. Thereafter, the County Board of Health established swine farm operation rules virtually identical to those of the ordinance. Initially, a trial court upheld the ordinances and rules. Then the Court of Appeals held the swine ordinances and Board of Health rules invalid because they were preempted by state statute, but upheld the zoning ordinance. On the second appeal, the North Carolina Supreme Court invalidated all the county ordinances and rules regulating swine farming. Generally, a county may regulate activities and facilities even when a general statewide law exists, unless there is a direct or implied conflict with state law. If such conflict arises, state law prevails regardless of whether the local ordinance is more stringent. One type of conflict arises when the state law either expressly states that it preempts local law, or when the statute implicitly shows that the legislature intended to implement a statewide regulation on a subject and exclude local regulation. So, counties are actually creatures of state and have only those powers granted them by the state legislature. That is context. Then the hierarchy of norm would come an issue. However, the framework could be complicated, not simply, unlike the unitary scheme of a constitutional structure. The court reached this conclusion after reviewing statements of a purpose and intent in the statutes. The court recognized that the County Board of Health regulations were more stringent than the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission's regulations. The county regulations were invalid, however, because they were not required to protect a public health and directly conflicted with state law. So what is conflict? Often we may see a perceived strength if the regulation in status would be stringent and could be tightened. However, in some cases, it also required of independent ground to increase the response, the public response. No valid ground would be found in this case, then could be dismissed and declared null. And in same frames, the licensing is one important administrative instrumentality to realize the goals and purposes of agencies. License for specific tank installers, not valid in Indiana. So you consider the materials later uploaded for your reference in the web page. And also now plan in this class scheme, the next class, federalism. What is that? You know the case in Overton Park. Justice Marshall made out test when in Overton Park he found that the judicial review provisions in Section 707 of the Administrative Procedure Act require secretary vote to justify what was in fact a politically expedient decision at the expense of politically powerless group. So the issue you see in the projection of the midst of hearing would be important as we survey in last class. Recall the magic words issue that comes up in the application of Section 554 of the APA. Courts meet our standard either when they find the magic words in the authorizing statute, because the problem is one that really will benefit from holding hearings, or as in the Florida East Coast Railway case, they do not find the magic words because judiciary hearings will serve no purpose. So actually the requirement was reduced into statute terms on the record. However, the code would upstage the case since it is entangled with the important constitutional value, or due process of law concept. Judge Stevens' majority opinion in Massachusetts versus EPA was satisfying in pursuing the Environmental Protection Agency to articulate a reason why the agency refused to take action when scientific reports pointed to the impact of carbon emissions on global warming. So I like to make some basic points in articulation, perhaps actually it guides you in principled way, I suppose. We live in a political culture in which the rule of law is not just a theoretical idea, but a practical reality that requires government officials to justify the exercise of power as something more than just a means of securing a personal advantage. Second, we live in a political culture that values fairness to all individuals, starting with the Declaration of Independence. The political culture in the United States has sought to promote a dignitarian view of human rights. Unlike the elaborate procedural rights guaranteed those accused of crime in the United States, a suspected thief in some part of the Middle East might have his hand chopped off on the spot. So no civilized law, I guess, in your imagination. A rhinoceros poacher in Zimbabwe might be summarily shot in the field. No due process of law would be cherished, perhaps disregarded to dehumanize. See, our political culture takes the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, seriously. This supreme law imposes rules of fairness to compel administrators and all other government officials to justify what they do. The Constitution specifically authorizes a Congress to make rules governing agencies, and Congress does so with a vengeance that leaves live selves groaning with new problems. One common law legal tradition holds the courts have the ultimate responsibility to say what the law means in concrete cases. So you see in order of a hierarchy in norms, the supreme law in this land, and Congress would be first branch to respond with the constitutional demands, and you also see the court law and responsibility, often viewed as ultimate responsibility to say what the law means in concrete cases. The body of legal precedent created through the aggregation of those concrete cases is the heart that drives the organs of administrative law. So, how much are you helped with these outlines about our understanding of this subject? So, it is actually no wrongs if you see a series of containing values and principles routinely. We hardly find a neatly organized system of commands. So, you may recall the illustrations of baseball. So it is actually on a continual basis. In the list of veto and line item veto cases, for example, we see the separation of powers doctrine colliding with the doctrine of delegation that gives agencies nearly unfettered a policy-making power. So in this case, you will see active administrator, line item veto. Is it permissible? It was once discussed involving a Korean context. So we generally deny this institution. We often receive the constitutional language as contrary. The U.S. practice would also come vague if we see the provisions of constitutions. A practice now considered to support line item veto. We see due process requirements laid out in detail in Goldberg, only to see Matthews and his progeny letting agencies get around the fair hearing requirements in many contexts and dilute them in others. So it is in flux, actually. The kind of flummox to be cured not in any settled permanence. So what the area is actually the twilight zone about the three perspectives of politics and public administration and law. We see case after case in which learned judges strenuously disagree with each other about what the rules of administration should say and do. Above all, we see no end to the debate about two critical questions. First, just what aspects of life should government regulate? One version or another of the slogan, "The year of big government is over," was uttered by President Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. It's actually a limited government. to boost the private sectors. You will also consider what kind of a privatization of military. So elective war is actually indispensable to respond with the desires and wishes of the American public. So they have no way to advance to wage the war. It's a war of terrorism and a just war about to address actually clamored in some aspect in the aftermath of war. What is the exact cause of war? Some scholars, not an isolated scholar, commented what is a privatization of a military war scheme to respond with the war. What mercenary nature of military have been plotted. So, one privatization, as I have illustrated in prison example. And it is an essential province of governmental function, how to surrender its role, how to ensure the accountability. We actually it is might be efficient. Legitimacy and democracy would come into question. And one strand to be debated oftentimes of a presidential election, how do we shape the governmental law, limited, a small government. For example, you may consider the Thatcher beliefs, political beliefs, and now the society would demise. What a manpower and families left to respond with the challenges which is imposing. Actually, global economy got worse in any sensibility. The privatization often is coupled with the word a deregulation. However, we see some point in distinction between two concepts. Privatization will still, deregulation will still see the governmental. Privatization will still see the government need to act on that responsibility. So we have to act, but we outsourced the manpowers or what the responsive teams or from private sectors. Deregulation could be one symptom we identify in the process of privatization. However, it totally make it dispensable away. The government will no longer engage in that delegation from the Congress. So perhaps could not contradict the congressional mandate. So might be skillful to avoid the direct contradiction. In some cases, for the areas without any statute ground, the administrative agencies could alter the context via deregulation. The concept is now focused perhaps in the current administration of the Republic of Korea. Well, it also will be viewed as favors the condition and social circumstances of nation to invite the foreign capitals or investments. So one important errand that the government has to consider seriously, since it is related with the context of national economy. That philosophy translated into deregulation in most areas, and it reduced overall funding of federal agencies. You see, over a series of administration in the past decades. Congress did not reduce agency workloads. Government agencies at all levels are responsible for more tasks than ever before. For example, while the government has gotten out of the business of regulating commercial affairs and schedules, government oversight of tobacco industry, firearms, and storage of toxic waste is on the rise. Perhaps more importantly, government regulation of security issues has grown by leaps and bounds following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And also, this perception would be applied to privatization. The security check could be processed against terrorism, and also privatization may be underwritten by these steps. What a security check would serve its faith and loyalty for the American public. However, how much do you expect? Actually, the agencies might be the kind of machination as a public agent. It might be attributed as incapable or incompetent. Often we like to draw upon the expertise of bureaus and one of a very competitive personal resources to be pursued. However, we see generally less extent in efficiency against a privatization. What is the strength of administrative agencies? They have souls to be loyal for the public. They take oaths in front of American public. For example, you see the inauguration ceremony from the president. And many public officials are compassionate with a high spirits and ideas. How do you consider GIs, the military personnel, about this loyalty? We often feel they spiritual adherence and drive to sacrifice themselves for the nation. That strength could not be minimal in any sense when we explore privatization. The distinction would be obvious as you imagine. And also, I stressed the importance of democratic accountability. So privatization would not be a worse concept, and actually need to be expanded in higher desirability areas. But it must be redefined in, about limitations and exceptions. Arbitrary drive could falter the sacredness of government or any general perception of the role of government and responsibility. Second, how actively should courts review and correct the perceived mistakes by agencies? Courts cannot possibly do it all, but if agencies are not threatened with the realistic possibility that a judge might review their activities, their need to justify routine decisions will vanish. And the idea of rule of law will become a dead letter. An important subset of the question, how actively should the courts be, is whether the court should review agency in action. So I have adverted on this point. The question is not just whether the court should correct agency mistakes in Massachusetts versus EPA, but whether they should intervene when agencies fail to act in the first place. So we have some refinements in this aspect about Korean Administrative Procedure Act. So a piecemeal of revamp was realized, you see in the context of that statute. So now some sectors could be made possible about positive order, the coercive order to act positively, not just to correct the agency action. Then, how do you consider the aspect of a prison privatization? Privatization of a prison management. We first consider its cost and perhaps democracy and equality. So actually there is continuing debate about whether private prisons offer any real cost benefit at all. As the cost savings requirements gets larger, however, there is an increasing danger that private prisons would need to sacrifice a prisoner's rights to meet the standard. Contrary to popular wisdom, many states operate their own prison system incredibly frugally. Alabama's public prisons, for example, spend $1.85 per day to feed each prisoner. Then imagine how worse the situation would be. So there are many other areas where public prisons are already run very frugally. In Alabama prisons, much of the work required to run the facility is performed by prisoners, which drastically reduce the cost of operation. It is necessary to ask in privatized industries what costs have the legislators in their statute allowed to be lowered by the private entities, and what is the likely effect on the freedom given private companies in those provisions. And you also be instinct about the issue of equal protection of laws. How do we perceive it equal between prisoners of a different management? The core privatization statute explicitly allows private providers to adjust workers' wages and benefits. The General Assembly recognized that such contracting may result in variances from legislatively mandated pay scales and other employment practices that apply to the state personnel system. In contrast, Washington, D.C. requires a private provider to offer displaced workers a right of forced refusal for jobs with a private company, and further requires the private companies comply with the government pay scale for 6 months. The D.C. statute restricts private providers' ability to meet cost targets by hiring more efficient workers or changing incentive structures. Any required efficiency gains must therefore come from the reduction of the other costs. And part of the reason for concern about the potential for human rights abuses in private prisons is that the major rationales for the relative strong relationship between democratic forms of government and the protection of human rights break down in the prison context. By democracy, I refer not only to electoral democracy, but the kinds of micro-democracies the administrative law can help create by providing for steady flow of information and public participation in privatization discussions. How much do you prefer the privatization of a prison? It is argued that democracies offer their citizens the ability to remove potentially abusive leaders before violations have become too severe. Furthermore, the civil liberties usually associated with democracies enable citizens and opposition groups to publicize government abuses. So, in a privatized context, the general public usually is excluded from regular information about the treatment of inmates in prisons. Publicly available information about cost and the contractual provisions is likely to replace a broader political discourse in a privatized setting. So, actually, the criminal police emphasized kind of ideas, the correction of social levers to restore a criminal justice. The perpetrator must be punished, condemned in response with imprisonment or death penalty or fines. And also the prison system need to assure the kind of educational goals of criminals. They would be a person to be restored to society, and they would become released upon completion of the sentence terms and others. Then the kind of education or a decent standard of a confinement or detention would be desired, or the dignitarian concept of humanity. And we also afford the separation of powers principle. What the Constitution is kind of replacement, a supreme law of land, replacement of a divine monarch. It's a divine and absolute to make the tripartite branches work. And actually, the work of government is beyond one concept and ideas that the principle would be directed toward what is there. And also, the human rights is considered. The prison context is very notorious to be experimental of a human rights abuse and others. A decent standard could not be debased to the worst point of human rights abuse. And we may be infuriated if it see its affordability and a high level of living within the prison some poverty group may feel the prisoners may get better. So the public policy is actually more liable to respond with a passion of public. So it is not an easy question to be resolved in the first place. So administrative hearing may do work in shaping the extent of privatization and the standard of condition to grant the private management. And what to consider involving minorities in prison. No thorough discussion of human rights issue in connection with U.S. prisons can be completed without some mention of the disparate representation of minorities in the U.S. legal system. A discussion of one state, Alabama, with a significant private prison population is instructive. The clientele there of many private prisons is likely to be a disproportionately minority. In Alabama, 73% of felony defendants are minorities, while black males are much more likely to be subjected to prison time and therefore have to live in a private prison. They are also correspondingly less able to influence either any privatization decision or any oversight protocols. I illustrated one contrasting view about this concern, and as well, what is that? At this moment, we have to see some what is a doubtful account? We may provide a battalion or two of troops to protect all fields in Nigeria if we so favor the privatization of military. And we may be ready to take on the doubtful account, the idea of conducting foreign policy by contract. The idea that such a duty can be delegated in the first place is certainly an arresting one. So Ted Koppel mentioned seductive notion of a mercenary army. What is democracy deficit? Which may be emerging, for example, in privatization of prison. What is how do you perceive minorities in prison setting about democracy deficit? And also, we have to consider seriously the transparency and accountability of private prisons. In order for a government to retain legitimate accountability for private prisons, the state must retain and be able actually to exercise step-in rights, that is, to reclaim any privatized part of its prison system. And to do this, it needs to have ongoing capacity and skill levels of its own. This can only be done if it remains a direct service provider in relation to some part, at least, of its prison population. So you also recollect the dominant profile of minorities in Alabama. And you have to consider the outer limits of privatization and prisons. In this purview, you'll consider disciplinary hearings. And exporting inmates, and also privatization of interrogation during wartime. Well, consider Al-Sharaf scandal. When it came into media spotlight last year, years ago, a connection between prison regulation and private firm involvement also became apparent. Through the private companies hired by the U.S. government were engaged in the interrogation of detainees and intelligence gathering. The limited supervision given to these private contractors and the abuse inflicted upon detainees by the employees on these firms dramatically highlights the human rights abuses that can occur in such contexts by both public and private employees. So, how are to be perceptive of this abuse? How much do you put credence on the government against a privatized company, privatized businesses? But the Pentagon was reluctant to have private armies outside its chain of command. So issues of loyalty and accountability also arose. I like to remind, for example, the strengths of public employees. And in the center of that loyalty, the presidency exists. That is why many in our democratic system live in a dual reality, decrying the president, whether it be Bush or Clinton, Reagan or Roosevelt, but respecting the presidency, the office of George Washington, the first among the heroes of our republic. Those offices that fall under a president deserve similar respect. Anyone who has served in government, from above private to cabinet official, knows this feeling. And they also know that the public and private sectors have different boundaries. Outsourcing tests these boundaries. So perhaps you can not inaccurate between efficiency and fairness, and a power and compassion, and also loyalty, accountability. By doing so, it pushes government to justify delegations of public power to private hands. Some said, as a democratic nation, sensitive to fueling serious human rights abuses, the frightening prospect of mercenaries conducting our foreign intervention is not what America is all about. One writer suggested, if the all-volunteer army cannot stop the war in Iraq, necessitating the abuse of private forces, perhaps the signals a vote against the war. So the context could raise the possibility to restore a private military, a compulsory military service. And the system was raised in serious wars of history. And now the context would come rather in a distinction about the Korean military we now explore a privatization of military, not a compulsory system. Still, we are on that, however. Outsourcing sovereignty occurs when the idea of privatization is carried too far. So, New York Times recently published a series of articles that label contractors as the fourth branch of government. Initially, but at its inception of term, the fourth branch denotes these administrative agencies. Now, administrative agencies often use the contractual contract as important instrumentality to execute their function. So it is a fourth branch. Recently, the Internal Revenue Service decided to outsource delinquent tax collections to the private sector. How do you perceive this progress? Outsourcing failures have been highlighted recently in the Coast Guard's decision to turn over to Lockheed Martin and Grumman the responsibility to manage a $17 billion fleet modernization program. Well, Coast Guard also one agency in this context, and it plainly demonstrates its weaknesses in some area. Of course, not definite to explicate the cases, whole cases of privatization entirely. However, the compulsion to delegate government responsibilities has earned President Bush the title of outsources in chief. So his political ideas would not disfavor this paradigm. So it has a pros and cons, and one alternative to address the national administration issues of national administration. So the concept, however, we see the era of privatization it has an intended cause as well as intended benefits. And the court, our expectation about active court role would be restricted in chances, since actually the court would perceive not best solution from the agencies. The court would like to see a reasoned context of administration. What is the reason? And their choice would be respected without any patent obvious error about a statutory interpretation and others. So, the President Bush's vision of an ownership society, he tried to build public support for reducing the size of government across the board. Actually, a small government is one concept, and the Republican ideas to prosper the nation, enterprises, could benefit. The gap is a byproduct of two converging forces: the regulation movement, which renders many government regulatory programs unnecessary, and the privatization movement, which transfers government activities to the private sector. And Homeland Security is one example. It seems to be the paradigm case. This multi-million-dollar agency formed virtually overnight to meet the national security preparedness challenge, has been struggling to perform its complicated mission. More than two-thirds of the department's most senior executives, including its fourth secretary, Tom Rich, have moved to private positions, some with companies who receive lucrative contracts from the agency. So you expect these important experts may be utilized later by the government, and so a private, a personal interest may be may come in reality as in contractual relation. Actually, the context could be similar about involving Chaebol in Korea. The companies they establish are doing also government work oftentimes. Of course, it could not be disposed in any one dealings. However, the context could actually be delicate about this wrong or rightness legally. What is evil within the contract? Their experience still stands to serve the public goals or others. The problem would be on some corruption or possible corruption or others. So I do not mean the first secretary should be viewed wrongly. So one example, and typically involved with Homeland Security, and one of central organs to address the important national commitment. Ultimately, the goal should be to balance the two positives of private and public sectors, efficiency and accountability, in ways that conform rather than threaten our legal and political relations. And I also advise to think about the meaning of sovereignty. The modern American scholar, for example, Stephen Krasner, usefully described 4 kinds of sovereignty: international legal sovereignty, Westphalia sovereignty, domestic sovereignty, and interdependent sovereignty. And also advise to think about the relationship between sovereignty and privatization. Okay, thank you for delay on this class. I have to stop here. And that would be all for this class. And as a schedule, we consider other topic in next class, federalism and perhaps liability of government. Okay, thank you for your attention. See you in the next class.